Peace be unto you. I am honored to be a part of this great convention and to have an opportunity to be among what I have now shared with everyone else. You are my family. And so I feel a responsibility and an obligation to do all that I can to be connected. Some of you probably were in the last session that I just finished, and we had a very engaging conversation about where we were and where we are at this point in time. And in particular, looking at where are the American Muslims in how they view the future. One of the areas in which I will be having a conversation with you, and I always like to talk to people as if you are with me in my home, so that it is not just a talk, it is a conversation. And while I understand that you cannot respond to me until at the end, I would like to at least have that conversation. When people think of the NAACP, that is an organization that has had a very unique history. And obviously, as many of you are aware, that history began in 1909, at a time in which our country was going through a lot of turmoil. My ancestors were not viewed as a positive part of this community, and in fact, probably going through some of the things that you are presently going through. It was during a time that we were scrutinized, during a time that we didn't trust people who looked like me, a time in which we wanted to make sure that once we left beyond the Emancipation Proclamation and we were able to get jobs in this great country of ours, that we would still have a group that was not viewed as equal in this great United States. A group that we would say we hold that this is self-evident that all men are created equal. Yet we as black people were not given that same opportunity to be viewed as equal. Well, as you can imagine, when you mistreat any person for so long, that person either believes what you are saying about them, or they continue to take enough until they explode. Well, what had happened for us as African Americans, we had had enough, and it was time for us to explode. We had made it from the plantation of being slaves. We had made it from moving out of the deep South, where most of us still stayed, until we realized we had no economic opportunities. And so we had what was called the Black Migration, to move from the South, where we had very limited opportunities, to the North, where it was said that you had the General Motors. And in some cases, there were wars that were going on. So there was an exodus to go where the businesses were so that we could get jobs. Not remembering that we are visible people, meaning that while I am American, I'm also black. And so when I go from the South to the North, I take my blackness. And when you are a visible minority, it is very difficult not to be seen or not to be remembered. And unfortunately, for whatever reason, there are those of yesterday, and unfortunately, there are those today that look for others for whatever reason, whether it's because we are less than because I am black, or I am less because I am Muslim. For whatever reason it is, it seems that in this great country, we have to have something to hold over someone else. And the part that always amazed me was many of these same people would say that they know who we refer to as Allah. But that was always very difficult for me to understand how you can have a spiritual relationship with God or Allah, and yet you have a superiority ideology about being better than Allah's other creation and children. Well, you know, when I was speaking to you about us coming to the great north, and we had the issue of segregation, and we had the issue that I remember as a boy, my grandfather would often have to fight a group that we spoke about in my last session, the KKK. I've noticed in this great country of ours, we were able to get rid of anything that was viewed as militant, that was black, whether that was the chains of Rap Brown, that was the Southern group that were young people for Students for Nonviolence, or CORE, Congress on Racial Equality. We were able in this country to get rid of anything that we decided by media, and we decided by our old friend, the FBI. To have surveillance of people in this great country. Surveillance of people to find out and to legitimize our dehumanization of a people. Little did we probably know that as that continued to happen, and as we got more tired, our ministers heard our complaints as well as Allah in our prayers, that we are tired of being sick of being tired, and we are tired of being viewed as less than. And we are going to not only call and ask Allah to help us, but we are finally going to figure out how we can help ourselves, and we are coming to you as our spiritual leaders to find a way to help us. So in 1909, the NAACP was founded. Now, it was founded and viewed to cover some of those ugly things that had happened to black people in the South. And those ugly things were horrific. I recall my mother saying that in the little sections down south, that the KKK, since they were known to intimidate people by fear, and remember, I think as American Muslims, that fear again, you know something about that we would create fear in the little conclaves and areas where blacks lived. So much so that when there was an injustice that whites felt were done, and a black man, usually a black male, and that says that male seems to be the threat, that they would send these individuals on horses, and they would wear these sheets over their head. And they made it very clear that as KKK, that we're not going to speak to you about fear, we're going to create fear. So they would do horrific things such as bring that man outside of his house, bring his children, his wife, all of the other neighbors together. And they would sentence this individual in such a horrific way that I never forgot as a child. I always loved horses up until that time. And my mother said she recalled that they made all of them. My mother was born in 1905, so you can imagine how old my grandfather would have been. But they were called all outside to witness the KKK, not allowing this man any sense of social justice or court or hearing, but to tie this man up in front of his community, in front of his children, in front of his wife and family, tie one leg to a horse to the right and the other leg to a horse in the left. And once the judgment had been given, you can only imagine what happened after that. Now, this man's body has been split, and it is being drawn throughout the community in which he once lived and walked. Now, there are some other horrific things that I could share with you that your history books won't tell you about, and that is why I had said in my conversation last evening about why it is important that you do not allow the media to write our story, because they will never write it in truth. But I want you to remember that man. Think of yourself, seeing your father, your husband. My mother never forgot that. Now that wasn't her father, but she never forgot that. Now, why would she share that with her children? So that we do not take for granted that we are free after the Emancipation Proclamation. So were they. So the intimidation that the KKK tends to use, and what we are now faced with for my American Muslim brothers and sisters, when we hear these what I call validated things for white supremacists, that is a very dangerous thing for us. In our last session, someone asked, is it really possible that such things could happen again? Could there be a concentration camp that happened to our brothers and sisters that were Japanese? Well, there are other concentration camps, as you well know. Our Jewish brothers and sisters are well aware of what that was. My MASICNA Turks were well aware of what happens when government does not agree with you. They are definitely Muslims. And there are many groups throughout our country and throughout the world who can tell this same story. Now, when we found ourselves finally able to get something inside of us to say that we would no longer accept this and take this, we finally realized something that I hope you realize, that you need one another. And you need one another not just to have a conversation, but to make sure that each of you survive. Now, they had thought the founding of the NAACP would do that. Well, the NAACP is not a very, let's say, aggressive kind of organization. We are more of an organization that is tied to legislative kinds of things. We are tied to making sure that we have a nice group of lawyers so that we can understand the issue and we litigate that issue in court. Well, you know, there are a lot of things that we can legislate, and we can legislate things that we can visibly identify that happens to you as people. But the one thing that even the NAACP and all the good work that it has been able to do, we cannot legislate the hearts and minds of people who do not love us. Well, that leads an awesome burden on us as a parent, as a neighbor, as a community, of what must we do to survive. Well, obviously, to survive, you've got to know your own story. You've got to know not only your story, you've got to know the oppressor. Now, we've talked a lot about what happens to us. Well, one of the ways in which you survive any atrocity, you better know your enemy. Don't think he or she is. You need to be very clear who he or she is, so that when you come together as a group, you can strategize and identify ways in which you're able to save not only your people, but demand your rights in a country that seems at times not to care about all of its citizens. When there was not in America, there were Muslims for thousands and thousands of years, educating, creating, giving, producing, loving, teaching. All of a sudden, we now find that Islam seems to be an issue. Islam an issue? Islam does not stand for hatred. Islam does not stand for extremists. You and I saw that one of the things and the tools that are used against us is to take an individual act and say, this is what the community does. No, that was what an extreme individual did out of our community. That is not the community. And they craft from having been in our community through surveillance. Now they craft a media message to give an innuendo or an assumption that we are all extremists, when they know that is a lie. But they leave the burden of proof of that lie on you and I. And so now we are faced not only with the individual kinds of things that the NAACP must do, and by the way, we work on membership, and it's open to all ethnic, cultural groups, races. We want everybody there. Now, some would say to you, Black Lives That Matter, that we're a little too, what? Perhaps too sophisticated. We're a little too easy on legislating everything. Now, as you know, the Black Lives Matter movement says one of the things that we learned a long time ago before we began the civil rights struggle in the 40s through A. Philip Randolph, direct action. Now, one of the things I will say that my beloved NAACP does very well, it investigates, it makes sure that it gets all the information and the facts, and then it litigates. The other thing it does, and that's something that I'm so pleased to know that our American Muslims are doing, you also have a national defense fund. That is crucial when you get to the legislative part of it. But what about that other part that we have to fight to make sure that our children are not discriminated in school against, or our women are not accosted and their hijabs torn off their heads and told that they must go back home? Well, you've heard last evening the professor was very clear. You are home. You are home. And no one, and not just us, no one in this great United States should have to be committed to any negative atrocities. When the Constitution says that we are all equal, well, once again, if that were the case, Brown versus Topeka, years back, when blacks were in their schools, whites were in their schools, and there was anything but equal. Not only were blacks limited going to the 8th grade, and some of you may not be aware, but after the 8th grade, those women and men who graduated, because of discrimination, they were only able to go to the universities during the summer when the whites were not in school normally, and they became the teachers who educated the other individuals in their communities. I thank God that those individuals gave the people that they taught all that they needed to be successful. Where then do we go from here as American Muslims? You've already heard my part on unifying yourselves. Unifying yourselves, and that's not going to be easy because it wasn't easy for African Americans. You're going to have to find a way to not only come together as a people, but to be proud of who you are. Linda spoke last night about being unapologetically Muslim. I love that concept. Unapologetic. You have a right not only to this great country, you have a right to your place in the world. And that place right now is in America. And when our president, who will be coming into office in the next few weeks, speaks of that new America, then let's make sure he understands in that new America, the Muslims are front and center, and we are unapologetic. And we will use those NAACP when we need to legislative. But right now, we're going to come together, and we're going to identify our common cause, and we're going to reach out to not only African Americans and Latinos, we're going to reach out to anybody who will join in on our mission. And that means some of the folks who don't look like us, because not every person who is white is against us. So anyone who is sympathetic with us, and we're sure that they are sympathetic, then we're going to make sure that those individuals are a part of how we move forward. Now, I'm not sure about everybody being in the room when we talk about how we're going to do this. If you know that you are being under surveillance, then that means you have something that is a threat. Now, you and I both know that Muslims are not a threat. Do we have individuals that can be threatening? Muslims have them, blacks have them, whites have them, everybody has them. Those are individuals, not us as a community. But when we come together to decide where we're going, we've got to figure out how to do that. Well, I also hope that when we figure that out, you're at the table. You have to be a part of that discussion. You have to decide at that point where your children, your grandchildren, and their future will be. And you cannot be afraid to let your voice be heard for that. An organization is only as good as its memberships. In the NAACP in the state of Ohio, I sit on the executive board, I'm over economic development. We have 60, what you would call chapters, we call units. It's the same in this state and others. We're organized throughout the state. We have a common agenda. Now, we don't always agree, and we fight to get to that common agenda. And we know that there are many agendas, but we choose strategically the ones we know that we can win today. And we go and chip away at that, and then we move forward to the other. I encourage you to consider that same as my brothers and sisters who are American Muslims. Find what and where you wish to go, and you decide who you want to go with that's going to take you to that location. I was thinking when I saw the children meeting in the rooms up on the upper floor, isn't this what it is about? Making sure that they have access. Making sure that they're not only a doctor, they're not only a teacher, but they're good people, like their grandparents were and their parents, but also to know that out of your children, there is another President Obama. Now, it may not be a he. It may not be a he, and I know that's another issue we have as Muslims. It may not be a he. Now, all of us fought for a year to get people out to vote. We didn't tell them who, because as you can imagine, in the NAACP, as a 501c3 and nonprofit and all of these other things, we can't decide what party you are. And I'm going to speak for Anthony, talking to my brothers and sisters. I know what political persuasion many of my Muslim brothers and sisters are. But I encourage you to be on both party sides, so that when the conversation arises about us as a people, we have legitimate people who are there to speak to our cause, to speak to our need. That will make the difference. And perhaps that will also open a door for our children. Now, I know that your days, like many people, that for whatever reason God has allowed us to go through what we go through. I just sincerely believe that the reason Allah is allowing us to go through what we're going through is so that we can be prepared and able to be the true leadership of this America. I ask you not to be concerned always about how people set you up. I ask you to be prepared for when they attempt to set you up, that because of your spiritual belief in God and your love of humanity, that He will always provide for you. God has not forsaken us. Perhaps He's preparing us to take and to do what we need. Satan sometimes prepares us for negative things. And have you noticed that sometimes God will take that negative thing that Satan placed upon us and turn it around for good? I sincerely believe, my brothers and sisters, that not only will you be successful in conquering this ugliness that face you today, I believe you are the conquerors. And as the conquerors, you will set the pace for the rest of the world. And your forgiving heart will allow America to truly be the America for all people. and I thank you for your time.